Hello and welcome to our monthly webinar featuring the Cultural Navigator and TMC's portfolio of solutions. Quick audio check with my panelists, Karen and Jorg. You can hear me okay and you can see me okay?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's get started. Thanks. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Our focus today is on the cultural orientations approach and realizing strategic performance in a VUCA world. And in order to talk about this, we're going to introduce our sixth edition of the Cultural Orientations Guide, called Maximizing Business Results with a Strategic Performance Framework. My co-authors and I are here today to talk about the contents of the book and how we have developed it, and I'll just do a quick introduction myself. My name is Lynn Putz. I am the Director of Solutions for TMC. We are a Berlitz company. And we focus on maximizing business results for international organizations. I'm pleased to introduce Jorg Schmitz and Karen Walsh. Jorg, do you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah, hello everyone on the call. I'm, as you can tell on the slide, first of all, it's delightful to be part of this panel of co-authors. I guess it took quite a little bit of work. But just a couple of things about my background. I'm a practicing anthropologist and currently the managing partner at Thomas Leland.
Great. Karen?
Greetings, everyone, anywhere where you are around the world. I am a professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management and have worked with TMC, with Jorg, and with Lynn for many years, and I'm very proud to be a part of this new version of the COG and looking at how we tie this together with strategic performance and leadership. Welcome, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Jorg. It's a pleasure to be with both of you today. A couple of housekeeping items for us to go through here real quick in order for us to address and keep us on time. We're going to reduce background noise by muting everyone during the presentation. And you can type questions in the question box at any time during the presentation. So don't wait until we're done speaking. We will take question and answer period for at the end of the presentation today. So today's session is being recorded, and we will post it on tmcorp.com, which is our corporate website, and we also put it out through social media channels as well. When we switch presenters, you may see a little pause in the presentation, so please stick with us. So moving into our objectives, what do we hope to achieve in presenting to you today? We're really going to focus on the cultural orientations approach and its differentiators in the space of intercultural studies and intercultural communication in the business world. We're really going to focus on 4 different aspects, and again, all of these are covered in the 6th edition of the Cultural Orientations Guide. But for the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to really focus in on the cultural orientations approach and the differentiators of it. And so we'll focus on 4 different areas. One, we'll talk about achieving strategic performance in a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous global environment, which is a term coined by the military quite a number of years ago. We're going to present a comprehensive cultural perspective, and we're going to do that by looking back in the industry and really understanding from our perspective, from TMC's perspectives, how we have evolved the cultural perspective to today's interpretation. We'll review some of the critical mindset and skills necessary for actually achieving strategic performance and give you some practical applications for realizing an inclusive environment and strategic performance, whether you're a leader, a team member, or an individual contributor in your organization. All right, so we've really identified what we're going to do today. We want to find out real quick who's on the line with us. So if you wouldn't mind filling out a quick poll, and the question that we have for you is, what is your organizational role? And if you could select one for us, please click on the radio button. If you're in talent management, organizational development, training, if you're a business line leader, or if you're other. And if you choose other, if you wouldn't mind typing into the QA box, in the question box, and letting us know exactly what your role is, that would be terrific. Thank you. Thanks. And it looks like we have a majority of others. So we'll take a look at the Q&A box after a little bit and find out who's actually on the line with us today. So thanks so much. Our primary minority population is in the training industry, so thank you, in the training role, I should say. All right, so just a quick introduction to the Strategic Performance Framework. This is the new framework that we have evolved through the work that we have done to write the book, and really looking at three different approaches to strategic performance, and an evolution through that, through those three levels is really where we want to focus our attention today. And the first ring is labeled cultural perspective, and that formally was labeled as our journey to cultural competence. So it includes an open attitude, self-awareness, other awareness, and really developing cultural insights, in order to get to the second ring, which is cultural skills. And those cultural skills have seemed to be the standard for developing and exercising our skill set across different cultural barriers or boundaries or differences. And those four include cultural due diligence as a first, then style switching, and cultural dialogue, as well as cultural mentoring. Being the four key skills, cultural skills. And then those move us into and get us ready for actually engaging in our business skill set, which is the art of influencing, the science of collaboration, the fine art of negotiating across differences, and then finally the underpinned by communication. So that's the structure as we have designed it, called the Strategic Performance Framework. And now I'm going to invite my colleagues to share their concepts as well. And I'll move it into Karen. Karen, if I could hand it off to you, that'd be great.
Okay. Do we have a participant question?
Yep. So our second poll is, and which of the following is a priority for enhancing your organizational performance, strategic performance? So please select one. What's your priority? Enhancing interpersonal communication, influencing across a matrix, strengthening cross-border negotiation skills, improving team collaboration, or achieving M&A and JV synergies? Let's see what our participants say. We're looking for the priority. Yeah, improving team collaboration being number one, and then influencing across a matrix environment. Excellent. Thank you so much for your involvement today. Now, let me pass that on to you, Karen.
Okay, so let's move to the next slide in terms of looking at what is exactly the culture orientations approach. And what we're looking here is expanding why we can take the cultural orientations approach that many of us have used for several years and applying this to more of the problems on the applied side. So as we begin to think about the work in culture, and we're going to talk a little bit about the way this has evolved over time, we're going to look at the problems that you've mentioned here. 60% of you have focused on team collaboration. And what we have found in the work around this area over time is ways that we can apply to this particular approach in increasing our particular skills that come from the academy. And many of us have studied anthropology, social neuroscience. I have looked at it in the world of social science. And what we have found is that the cultural orientations approach is deeply grounded in the new disciplines and the new theories that are going to look at ways that our brains have been acculturated and how we now can be more conscious through our self-awareness, and that we can actually find ways to consciously create the kind of social environment that we would like to work in negotiation and collaboration. So we find that this has become much more comprehensive in the way that we look at applying the cultural orientations approach. So as we move forward, looking through ways that we can take the customized learning solutions and the certifications that many of us have had in the cultural orientations approach, and being more specifically focused on the art and the science of these particular skills. So as you look at this particular approach, we're going to look at how it has become quite proven and how scalable we can take the cultural orientations approach through the Cultural Navigator, and finding ways to increase the inclusive environment in organizations in order to manage what's happened in what we call the VUCA world. What has become so volatile? What has become increasingly uncertain? Why is there more complexity as we move from west to east in a lot of the structural forces that are changing the way we look at business, the way we look at leadership competencies, and the increased competencies we need in a multicultural world? So what we're looking at is this adaptation to the VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. As we look at the next slide and we think about VUCA, what are the ways that we can increase our vision? What are the ways that we can increase our understanding? And what are the ways that we can increase our clarity when we are living in an extremely ambiguous world? So what we have found in our research and the way that we've looked at this particular world of the cultural orientations approach is that the methods and the skills in the key cultural skills increase the ability to have vision, understanding, clarity, and adaptability and agility. So as we look at the next slide, one of the other components that increase this ability to be able to be clear and to be certain is actually part of what we call the most interesting times in terms of population growth and cultural diversity and the larger structural themes that are going to impact us in our work situation. I'll hand this over to Lynn because she has some great ideas of how we can look more specifically at some of the changes we see in this population growth by region.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, the visual that you see in front of you identifies the population growth by region compared to from 1950 to 2013 and to 2050, and that's research that's by The Economist as of last year, 2013. And the concept that we want to draw your attention to, and the reality that we want to draw your attention to, and that we're very interested in, is you see the red band in the 1950 comparison, and you see the red band in the 2013 comparison. Those both indicate the growth rate in Europe, 1950 and 2013 being much smaller. And in 2050, you might identify that there is no red band. In fact, there's a negative growth rate in Europe. Contrast that with the Africa population. And you see in 1950 there's no light blue band. In 2013 there is a small slice at that very tip. And then in 2050 it takes up twice as much space in this band as in 2013. And so we see this population trend shifting from a Europe-based, North America-based population growth to a other world-based, if you call it that from a North America perspective, or an Africa-based growth rate. Asia-Pacific being still a very strong area of growth and population development as well. Latin America staying strong. So the questions that I ask you to think about and that we think about in this field are, how much do you know about your Africa population of consumer, of employee, of managers, of leaders? What does it take to be successful leading across these different regions of the world that perhaps you haven't had as much experience leading or developing employee pools for? So very interesting thoughts to present to you. The population growth as well has been bumped by 2 billion over the next 30 years as well. And so what was formerly 7 billion is now a 9 billion amount of population growth, and 30% of that new population figure comes from Africa. So very interesting times, and definitely a platform to consider as we look into what are the new skills, what are the new talents, and what does leadership look like coming into a VUCA world. That is a very interesting time in the world's development. So thanks, and we look forward to moving it to Jorg. I'll hand it off to Jorg now.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn and Karen. I mean, and I want to actually weave a little bit of a historical perspective on this approach, the cultural orientations approach, and how it has evolved and has kept pace with the changing conversations and changing challenges that we are facing as we are experiencing shift. And what Lynn, what you just talked about, actually is a great example of a particular demographic shift that we knew about for a long time, have talked about for a long time, but often, and we're finding this in many of our clients and businesses, the reality of it is only striking now, which is a really interesting, I don't know what it says about our human brain, and Karen talked about neuroscience and insights there, that very often we understand cognitively there is a problem, but we don't know what it means yet. And that's probably a phenomenon of the VUCA environment as well. We know there are changing forces around us, and yet we have such a hard time understanding what it means and taking action. We have seen this certainly also in the field of intercultural communications or cultural competence, where the world that we came from, the old world, if you will, when even TMC originated in 1987, was a world in which we cast cultural differences in nationality terms. And that was a world when even business was looking at, okay, we're expanding, we're now exporting, or we are building operations in Japan, we're going to China for the first time, we are expanding our product portfolio in France or in Italy, or any of these questions. And hence the intercultural world has very early on focused on country as the unit of analysis. So if we are going and we're doing business in Japan, let's find out something about the Japanese. The cultural orientations model, as many of you will know from your own use of it and exposure to it over the years, is essentially a synthesis of major research that was conducted around cultural differences based on scholars and various different research programs, generally from a Western context. And out of that came a model of multiple strands of cultural differences that have a very strong empirical basis. Many of them first applied in a country or national settings. As a business, TMC at the very beginning conducted a lot of country briefings and applied this knowledge on a country level because business was moving that way. Globalization and the evolving conversations around diversity and multiculturalism in organizations have changed those applications. So we needed to adapt to them as well. Out of that came the Cultural Orientations Indicator, which was a significant development, as many of you who've gone maybe through this evolution can attest. Namely, here we are moving the discussion of culture not away from nationality and towards us as individuals. How have we, based on where we grew up and our individual experiences, how has culture given us an imprint in the pattern of our preferences and how we orient towards the world, towards other people based on that? So our nationality is not the predictor of our individual profiles. It becomes a factor in shaping who we are as individuals. Alongside with this view came a need in many organizations to actually understand what does it mean to operate as a global business. How does being global change the conversation about differences and collaborating and teaming and all those good things. And so together with this we built a Doing Business Globally learning suite, which really oriented people towards developing a global mind and skill sets. We put all of this online into the Cultural Navigator web platform, and not only was it now an online tool that was accessible to people across an organization, creating a common and shared language for difference, we also tied it to a certification, the COM-COI certification, as it was known first, that helps organizations to build this, this knowledge of how to operate and effectively team and collaborate globally across differences into the fabric of the organization through internal practitioners. We applied this to an evolving diversity and inclusiveness conversation, and all of this in 2014 really evolved further into not only our focus on strategic performance, but certainly also the idea of a cultural orientations approach that, on the basis of all of that development, actually gives practitioners a way of surgically focusing on the level of culture that need to be focused on in order to further and advance the collaboration and essentially the strategic performance of an organization. Out of that came an approach that is able to identify and address cultural issues at 6 distinct levels of culture: national, individual, identity group, and those are subcultures, if you will, as well as team, national culture, of course, and functional culture as well, and function being let's say the difference between an HR function and a marketing function or an engineering function and so forth. So we are able in this approach to help practitioners, those whose job it is to advance the organizational performance readiness, and give them a tool and an entire approach to address cultural disconnects and cultural gaps at various different levels, namely those levels that matter most to the performance, hence the strategic performance of organizations. And that's, I think, the thing that makes us very excited about what we have put together in this new cultural orientations guide, to really put all of this together in very practical as well as theoretically sound ways. So if we move on from here, then all of this is tied together by a view of culture that, again, is almost anthropological in its perspective, namely looking at culture as simply the way that we connect our behavior, our beliefs and assumptions, as well as our emotions. So tying, and I think this distinguishes the TMC approach to culture, tying culture very much to the discoveries in the field of emotional intelligence and neuroscience. And in this publication, the New Cultural Orientations Guide, we actually have a couple of chapters where we go into actually those connections and the scientific foundation that we are trying to synthesize here. I think what is important is that culture is essentially a pattern that structures the connections between behaviors, beliefs, and emotions. Norms being the outcome on one, social norms that we can talk about, discuss, and observe. Those are the connections between behaviors and beliefs, the way we make sense out of behaviors. And then there are then there is a level underneath all of this, which is how beliefs and assumptions are connected to our experience of the world and our emotional makeup. And those could be considered values. This is really a very important way of an entry point into a cultural conversation to understand how, when we start to look at human behaviors, especially in groups and between groups, and try to disassociate behavior, beliefs, and emotions from one another, we can actually structure a gateway into unlocking some of the disconnects and gaps that manifest at those 6 levels of culture that we reviewed earlier. So if we advance the slides for a moment, that's really what we are talking about when we are describing a cultural perspective, namely a view of culture that is based both in anthropology and links together the scientific foundations that are very current in all of our management and leadership conversations, namely around neuroscience and emotional intelligence.
So what we have found is quite interesting is the convergence of the sciences from the social neuroscience, emotional intelligence, and leadership work that basically we have put together in this particular volume is to show how the learning from social neuroscience is how the brain learns, and this is what we've looked at in terms of our cultural experiences. There's a pattern of the way that we have learned, the attachment we have to our own preferences and value systems, and how underneath the iceberg, which now the social scientists in neuroscience basically say that we have learned particular cultural preferences from our family culture, the host culture, and this complexity of cultures that our identity is formed. And what's very interesting in terms of what we're learning about how we can use our brains to change our brains and to understand what we have learned from the patterns of reinforcement, expectations, and how we carry around the software in our brain of expectations where we will reward others who will actually abide by and behave in the way that we have been acculturated to. And as we've been talking about here, with this constant complexity and uncertainty of working with others who may have strong attachments in other particular value preferences, it makes it very difficult, and there's a lot of social dissonance when we are looking at collaboration and working together in a negotiation and having impact in our influence. So what the COA and the COI has been very instrumental with is helping us to understand where have we gained and learned our particular preferences, how can we understand through gap analysis the other's awareness, and how can we increase our cultural perspective so we move from stereotypes of national cultures or particular organizational cultures, which is very judgmental and evaluative, by using the COA as an approach to understand in non-judgmental language, non-judgmental approaches, what are some generalizations that someone from a particular host country or someone from a particular organization might have those particular attachments. And through this process of our self-awareness, other awareness, we gain cultural insights, and we move across this continuum from denying or defending or minimizing our particular approach or value system to acceptance and adaptation and integration. And when it comes to looking at brain work, the new science around social neuroscience is that something happens in our brain to move from defense to acceptance, and then this increases the adaptation and the integration of our behavior when we're looking at the actual skills of negotiation, influence, and looking at ways to collaborate with others using this non-judgmental language underneath the iceberg as we begin to increase impact in strategic performance. So as we look at the next slide, this is where we're looking at the intervention of the performance of style switching, cultural mentoring, cultural due diligence, and cultural dialogue. So those of you who are familiar with the COA approach know that we've spent quite a bit of time addressing this over the years. But this particular volume, where we are in our evolution, as Lynn and Jorg have pointed out, is there a significant approach here to isolate and to work on the art form of style switching, cultural mentoring, and these 4 key cultural skills. So you'll see a lot more attention to this in this particular version of the cultural orientation approach. And so I'll hand this over to Lynn, if you would like to comment on the key cultural skills.
Go ahead, Jorg. You had something you wanted to interject.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject because it's actually, I think, a really important point that in this approach, we don't see culture as something that is static. We discuss it as a process. We also see it as something that is changeable and eminently something that we can create and co-create with one another. And I think I just want to, bring out that point, make that very strongly, because that is a different way of thinking about culture and discussing cultural solutions from other ways that you find culture being discussed. And I think through Karen's work significantly also scientifically supported, which is very exciting in fact.
And in fact, this is where our cultural orientations indicator has the most impact in a business environment, because we can identify at a point in time what our preference is, and as it's showing up in the workplace across how we interact with people, like in the blue area of the indicator, the thinking style, or how we process information, which is the green area, and then our sense of self, how we're motivated in the workplace and how we see ourselves showing up. And it's interestingly the tension that we feel in the workplace between how we prefer to show up, how we prefer to interact, how we prefer to think and are motivated, as opposed to and in juxtaposition to how we are actually showing up, based on the cultural norms of the organization, the cultural norms of the team, the cultural norms of our leadership, of the national societal implications on the workplace environment. There's a daily tension, and where there's tension, there's growth, but where there's tension, there's also opportunity for disenfranchisement, for disengagement, and for lots of roadblocks to be put in the way of our business engagements. So that the COI can be seen as a prelude to the strategic performance framework, and it can also be seen as a key and essential core in the middle of the 4 key cultural skills to help us identify where we are in terms of our preferences and where our skill set is that needs to be stretched, needs to be developed, needs to be identified and moved forward. And so that takes us into really a holistic approach to the strategic performance framework. Looking at all 3 of the rings together, you see on the far right-hand side the skills of influencing, collaborating, negotiating, and communication. You're really ready. You're prepared, you're, as a professional, you are open to the different ways of doing business across the globe, across the functions, across the organizations, and across the industries. that are most effective and most valuable and gain the most rewards from the style switching or the capabilities that you bring as a culturally competent professional. And so that's why we get into that last ring. And in fact, this is where our practical examples come into play. The applications that we have identified here. We just want to mention a few of those examples, and I'm going to toss it back to Jörg here to start us off. We have 3 examples based on time. I don't know that we're going to be able to get to each one of them, but we will have those available in the slides in the recorded version of this as well. But let me pass that back to Jörg. Which one would you like to start with, Jörg?
Well, I mean, it's probably not a bad idea, given that there is a lot of attention, you know, by the people who are listening to us at the moment, on collaboration and teaming, that we may start with that. But I think as an example, and obviously it's you know, we can't also give the specifics of the organization, but I think there are some really interesting you know, examples to be gleaned from this particular case. This was an organization that was suffering by essentially, I mean, it had functionalized its operation and was suffering from a very typical silo environment, right? We implemented the cultural orientations approach really in 3 phases, and we prepared the functional leaders primarily for this kind of an application of a cultural perspective to their functional silos. Very often you need to do some education first, because the dilemmas of silos has not been cast as a cultural challenge, and very often we need to work with leaders, of course, to figure out how does a cultural perspective open up new opportunities for achieving breakthroughs in this particular case. And that's certainly what we needed to do as the first step. Once there was a traction for the idea of understanding what is happening or what is being sub-optimized in the organization because of those silos, we can then actually dig deeper and apply and use actually the various different, the 3 dimensions of the cultural orientations model and indicator to actually map out some very significant gaps between those different business functions. And we did this in a number of sessions where we got a clear idea of, okay, here is how those functions can be described very differently from a cultural perspective. And with that specificity, we then actually could implement what we call cross-functional workouts. These were applying the principles of cultural dialogue as we laid it out in not just in this particular edition of the Cultural Orientations Guide, but overall within the Cultural Orientations approach. We took those principles and essentially created cross-functional workouts that really yielded an articulation and identification of new shared norms and commitments to breaking through those silos. In fact, it was a big challenge for the organization, and we needed to also think about how can we measure the impact. And the goal was to shorten product development cycles. You can just understand, if you're looking at it from the perspective of shortening product development cycles to get to market and seize windows of opportunities to launch products in the market better, that the impact, the value of creating breakthroughs in cross-functional collaboration for that organization was extremely high. So this is one example. Lynn, do you want to take us into another example briefly?
I'd be delighted to, yes. And Karen, please chime in if you have thoughts here. So I'll talk about the middle box, negotiating inclusive norms. We have a case in point where actually a bid was lost by one of our clients. They were in pre-sales with their customer. And the engineering teams, again, the functional level breakdown occurred with the engineering team of our clients not being able to negotiate effectively and collaborate at all with their customer. And so we had our client had a multi-million-dollar pre-sale opportunity disappear for them. And so, of course, that raises the issue to the CEO level and to the senior-most attention. And the CEO came into the SVP of HR's office and said, this is not going to happen again. Whatever we need to do at the organizational level, we need to do it. And so we were happy to step in as the organizational partner to our clients and help them embed champions of culture, of understanding, and of communicative dialogue to their organization. And we help them embed COA practitioners in order to effect that and make that happen. And the results were at the 3-year mark that they had embedded practitioners across the world in the organization. And in so doing, created a shared common language, non-judgmental vocabulary, as we've discussed many times already today. We saw a shift in a regional cultural preference into a global cultural thinking process that was very inclusive of the various regions that comprise the organizational structure. There was a decrease in the cultural mishaps that were occurring, and these metrics all came from 360s that included a full picture of the organization from top to bottom, as well as of employee satisfaction surveys, where that information was filtered and distilled from across the enterprise. There was an enhancement of style switching capability, and again, we got that from the employee satisfaction survey, that they felt better understood across the organization by others. And then an increase in the cultural dialogue. And what that looks like is, you know, I prefer to work in this kind of style. I wonder, maybe that may be an opportunity for us to discuss and clarify and reach a better understanding of how to discuss and how to communicate more effectively based on how I prefer to show up. How do you prefer? That's what cultural dialogue is really about. It's a very basic communication around the differences that you bring from your norms and your values growing up. We find that so important and so quite often overlooked. And so at the end, about a 3-year process and a 3-year cycle, the inclusive workplace emerged at the organizational level, and they saw a ROI in terms of the increased win rate across the organization, across the sales structure, and the implementation of those sales. So great example. Go ahead, Jörg.
Yeah, what is interesting about this, and I'm just interjecting it as a comment, but that while greater collaboration is the goal, the collaboration started by collaborating about how we will collaborate, right? So it's kind of it's a very interesting way of actually grabbing people's attention to what they really care about. Namely, let me have input in how we do things so that we can all focus on what we need to accomplish together. And I think that's a very important principle here, and it speaks to what we talked about earlier, that culture is dynamic. It's something that we can co-create, change, shift in order to support our strategic performance objectives. And once we unlock and empower people with doing that, we are really unlocking a lot of the performance potential that we didn't sometimes even know it existed, right? In both of the previous cases, I think we had leaders who were quite surprised about what their organization was capable of. And I think the third example is another example of that.
And for time purposes, let me just bring in Karen. What comments do you have, Karen?
And this is also very interesting in terms of, I have studied negotiation for almost 30 years. And what I find is also very fascinating right now in the field, this is another place where there's a convergence, is that much of the work in negotiation right now is around finding a way to bring the shadow of negotiation out into the open. which basically means how are we going to negotiate? Rather than guessing, rather than dancing, that there's actually very specific dialogue, which we would say is cultural dialogue, to discuss how we are going to negotiate. How do I prefer to negotiate? And let's explore together how we are going to negotiate both our norms and the actual outcome of the negotiated agreement or process. So I just wanted to add that this is also a convergence in the fields that I find very exciting in the cultural orientation approach. Back to you, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen and Jorg. Excellent. And again, it's where the action impacts the workplace that we're after. How do we get to strategic performance? And it's a process that we feel really excited about. So I wanted to just poll our participants one more time. And the question that we'd like you to ask or answer at this point is, do you have in your organization a cultural competence development process embedded into your system already? And, you know, just go ahead and choose yes or no. And if yes, tell us a little bit about that in the QA box, because we'd love to capture that and talk about that a little bit in the QA session. And if no, we'd be pleased to help you with that. So again, chat into the chat box if you would like some support in that aspect of your organizational change and development. I'd like to now invite you to our very next Cultural Navigator webinar series. We have a series every month, and next month's session is focusing on global leadership skill building. We'll feature David Lang, our Global Leadership Practice Group leader, and that's next Tuesday, June 17th, not next Tuesday, but June 17th, and that's at the same time. And we want to invite you to purchase a copy of the Cultural Orientations Guide. You will find ordering information on our corporate website, tmcorp.com. We also invite you to learn more about the Cultural Navigator as a platform that houses our Cultural Orientations Indicator, as well as learning and country information, as well as networking capabilities to collaborate with others. And so you can get an introduction to that at the address right below our corporate website. It's explore.culturalnavigator.com. At this point, I'd like to close out the official time on this webinar and move us into the QA session.